Spring, 1847. Along the marsh-covered coastline between South Carolina and Georgia, fishermen set out each morning expecting nothing more than a good catch from the Savannah River. Instead, they began hauling in the dead. At first, authorities counted 17 bodies. 6 weeks later, the number had climbed to 43. By autumn, local newspapers stopped publishing exact figures altogether. Rather than alarming the public, editors hid behind vague phrases such as additional casualties and ongoing tragedies. The truth was far more disturbing. Every victim showed the same unmistakable signs. Dark bruises circled the neck. Their lungs were filled with water. Although the bodies were recovered from different rivers, plantations, and counties and months apart, the evidence suggested they had all met the same horrifying end. Someone had forced each man's head beneath shallow water and held it there until the struggle stopped. The victims came from different places. The killer did not. Hidden for generations inside neglected court archives in Charleston were documents few people ever bothered to examine. Those forgotten records revealed details the newspapers refused to print. Witness after witness described seeing the same mysterious figure. A lone man standing near the water shortly before another death. Then, moments later, he was gone. No footprints, no sounds, no trail, nothing. The mystery refused to disappear. Even 16 years later, during the Civil War in 1863, Confederate officers were still filing reports about an unidentified killer whose victims died in exactly the same manner. Different uniforms, different era, the same signature. When Reconstruction finally drew to a close in 1877, more than 200 white men, including plantation owners, overseers, slave catchers, merchants, and even a federal marshal had died under eerily similar circumstances. Yet no one was ever arrested, no confession was ever made, no grave was ever dug for the man responsible. Perhaps the most unsettling detail of all was this: across the low country, countless enslaved men and women almost certainly knew exactly who the killer was, yet not one of them ever revealed his name to the authorities. Before we uncover the legend of the man history would remember as the River Ghost, take a moment to subscribe if you enjoy forgotten mysteries and dark historical stories. And while you're here, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Every place has its own hidden legends, and every legend deserves to be remembered. Because this story does not begin with bodies floating in a river. It begins 16 years earlier with ink drying inside an old ledger. March 12, 1831. Savannah, Georgia. Outside the county courthouse, a slave auction was underway. The air hung thick with humidity. The smell of marsh water mixed with horse sweat as buyers examined the people lined up before them like merchandise. Among the faded records preserved today inside the Georgia Historical Society is a brief entry that appears almost insignificant. Samuel Field Hand, 23 years old, healthy, no visible defects, sold for $800 to Thaddeus Claymore. To the auctioneer, Samuel was nothing remarkable. He was one of 15 enslaved people transported from a struggling tobacco plantation in Virginia. Tall, strong, scarred across the back, built for hard labor. The auctioneer carefully inspected his teeth, measured his height, admired his physical condition, and noted the old whip scars that covered his body. What he believed he saw was another broken man. Head lowered, eyes fixed on the ground, a laborer who had learned that survival depended on obedience. But there was one thing no buyer noticed. Samuel could read, not only simple English, but complex texts. He also understood Gullah, the language spoken throughout the coastal slave communities, along with enough Creek and Catawba to communicate with native people who still moved through the surrounding swamps. Those skills had never been taught openly. They had been stolen from whispered conversations, forgotten books, unattended maps, and countless hours spent quietly listening while others believed he understood nothing. Over the years, Samuel had developed one extraordinary talent. He learned how to disappear without ever leaving. He watched everything, he remembered everything, and almost no one noticed he was watching. The man who purchased him that day, Thaddeus Claymore, owned one of the largest rice plantations along the Savannah River. He proudly called it Riverbend. Stretching across nearly 4,000 acres, the plantation had made the Claymore family wealthy for generations. Claymore considered himself a civilized man, educated, well-traveled, interested in philosophy, agriculture, and modern ideas. He often convinced himself he was kinder than most plantation owners. He rarely separated families. He claimed punishments were given only when absolutely necessary. He believed such treatment proved slavery could be practiced with humanity. History tells a different story. No amount of kindness can transform captivity into freedom. A prison remains a prison, even when its walls appear less cruel. And sometimes, when everything is taken from a man, he does not break. He becomes something far more dangerous. Rice cultivation along Georgia's low country was among the harshest labor in America. Workers spent endless hours standing waist-deep in stagnant water beneath an unforgiving sun. Mosquitoes filled the air. Disease spread constantly. Malaria, yellow fever, dysentery. These were not unusual dangers. They were part of everyday life. Records from Riverbend suggest that nearly 40% of the enslaved workers died before reaching the age of 30. Those who died were simply replaced. On March 15, 1831, Samuel arrived at Riverbend in chains. He passed beneath the plantation gates, walked beyond the grand white mansion, the stables, and the overseer's quarters before reaching a row of crude wooden cabins where the enslaved workers lived. He was assigned to the third gang of the lowest labor division, reserved for new arrivals and those considered troublesome. Its overseer was Nathaniel Boone. Boone ruled through fear. His braided leather whip rarely left his side. Work too slowly. You were beaten. Pause too long. You were beaten. Speak without permission. You were beaten. Samuel accepted every order without complaint. He rose before dawn, ate his meager breakfast, and spent long days planting rice in flooded fields that slowly destroyed the human body. To Boone, he was invisible, just another laborer among hundreds. But Samuel was never simply working. He was studying. Each day, he memorized another piece of Riverbend. Every canal, every patrol route, every weak embankment, every hidden trail leading into the swamp. He observed which overseers drank too much, who wandered alone, which guards became careless after dark, and where the river ran deep enough to conceal what others would never find. Like water itself, Samuel moved quietly, patiently, unnoticed. And he waited. Marcus remembered where he'd seen Samuel the day Gaffin died. Near the lower canals, a woman named Letty remembered Samuel coming back to his cabin late one night, clothes wet, hands muddy around the time Stokes vanished. They didn't accuse him. They didn't gossip loudly. But a quiet understanding began to pass from mouth to mouth when the sun went down and the overseers were gone. Something had changed. Someone was fighting back. The third death ended any illusion that this was simple bad luck. On November the 19th, 1834, Luther Pettigrew was supervising a work gang at one of the remote fields in the northwest corner of the plantation. Pettigrew was a name people spoke with dread. He was known for punishment that went beyond discipline into cruelty that made even other overseers uncomfortable. Being assigned to his gang meant living with a constant expectation of pain. That afternoon, the sun was dropping behind the cypress trees, and long shadows crawled over the flooded fields. Pettigrew stood near one of the main irrigation canals, shouting orders. A worker named Cyrus, about 30 yards away, heard the overseer's voice rise in anger, then twist into something else. Surprise, alarm, and then a sudden splash. Cyrus looked up. Pettigrew was no longer on the bank. He was in the canal, thrashing, armed, striking the water, head going under and coming up again in desperate gasps. Cyrus dropped his tools and sprinted toward the canal along with 3 other men. By the time they reached the edge, Pettigrew had disappeared beneath the murky surface. They dove in, feeling blindly in the cold, muddy water. It took them nearly 20 minutes to drag his body out from where it had wedged against a submerged post. What they saw on the bank shocked even men who'd seen too much. Pettigrew's throat was covered in dark oval bruises. Bruises shaped like fingers. Bruises that said clearly this man had not slipped. He'd been grabbed. He'd been choked. Then he'd been drowned. The county constable, a man named Witt, came to investigate. He questioned every enslaved worker who'd been in the field. No one admitted to seeing a struggle. No one described a fight. They all said the same thing. They heard a shout. They heard a splash. They looked up. Pettigrew was already in the water. Under pressure, Cyrus finally added something else. Something that would echo far beyond Riverbend. Something came out of the water, he said. Dwight asked him to explain. Cyrus tried and failed. He shook his head, eyes distant, reliving that moment. 1 minute, Mr. Pettigrew was shouting, he said. Next minute, something just rose up. By the time I looked, he was gone. Dwight wrote it down, but didn't know what to do with it. Something came out of the water. Sounded more like superstition than evidence. With no suspect and no clear testimony, he filed it as death by drowning at the hands of person or persons unknown. Pettigrew was buried beside Gaffney. Another overseer hired, another grave filled. But Cyrus's phrase stuck. Something came out of the water. It was how the enslaved people had experienced these deaths. Sudden, invisible, unstoppable. One moment, the powerful man was shouting, untouchable. The next, he was gone, dragged down by hands no one seemed to see. 3 deaths in 4 months on the same plantation would have been alarming on their own. Claymore tried to tell himself it was terrible luck. Then the stories from other properties began to drift in. In December 1834, a slave catcher named William Dorsch disappeared near Haywood Plantation, 15 miles upriver. His horse was found loose. Dorsch was never found. In January 1835, a merchant named Ambrose Talley, who bought rice from planters and shipped it to Charleston, was discovered with his throat cut on a back road between 2 estates. His money was untouched. In February, 2 more overseers vanished from neighboring plantations, both while making evening rounds. No witnesses. No explanation. By March 1835, plantation owners all along the coastal lowlands were meeting behind closed doors, speaking in anxious, low voices. They didn't yet have language that felt safe enough to use in public. But they knew 3 things. The deaths were too frequent to be coincidence. They were too similar to be random. They were aimed at a certain kind of man. Those who upheld slavery with particular cruelty. Somewhere in those fields and canals, someone was hunting them. Someone who knew the land better than any overseer ever would. Someone who understood where water was ally, where mud concealed, where darkness erased footprints. That's when the name started. Not in any official record, not in any newspaper, but in the slave quarters, in whispered color, in songs and stories that white ears weren't meant to understand. A figure took shape, the river ghost, a man who moved like water, a shadow who struck near rivers, creeks, canals, and swamps. A presence no white man could predict, and no enslaved person would betray. Some said he could breathe underwater. That some said he vanished into fog. Some swore he wasn't human at all. But the older people, the ones who had lived with cruelty long enough to recognize what human rage and human patience could do, they knew better. They'd seen men beaten and broken. They'd also seen a few who refused to break. To them, the river ghost wasn't a monster. He was a man who watched, a man who waited. A man who had finally decided that if the river could swallow the bodies of the enslaved, it could swallow the bodies of the masters, too. And some of them, when they watched Samuel moving quietly through the fields, never punished, never loud, always watching, they began to wonder. Not out loud, not where anyone could hear, but in the silent space between one heartbeat and the next. Is it him? By the spring of 1835, Thaddeus Claymore was a man unraveling. He didn't show it publicly. Planters never admitted fear, but his nights had become sleepless. His routines tense, his eyes constantly scanning the fields as if the rice itself might rise up against him. 3 overseers from Riverbend were dead. Several more from neighboring plantations had vanished or washed up in shallow water. A merchant was found with his throat cut. A slave catcher had disappeared without a trace. And all of it, every death, every disappearance, had happened near water. Claymore didn't believe in spirits. He didn't believe in curses. He believed in patterns. And the pattern pointed in one direction. Clear's throat. Someone was killing men who upheld slavery. Someone who knew the land intimately. Someone who moved invisibly. Someone who waited for the perfect moment before striking. He began replaying details in his mind, tying threads together that had gone unnoticed before. Samuel's position in the outer fields. Samuel's calm, almost unsettling obedience. Samuel's ability to move without drawing attention. Samuel always being assigned near the areas where deaths occurred. Samuel's cabin always tidy. Samuel's tools always sharp. Samuel's expression always unreadable. No one else saw it, but Claymore did. And the certainty grew in him like a sickness. If Samuel stayed at Riverbend, Claymore would die next. The decision to sell the ghost. On October the 15th, 1835, Claymore stood on the veranda of his plantation house, staring across his fields as dusk settled over the low country. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of mud and decay rising from the flooded patties. He thought of Horace Gaffin face down in muddy canal water, Benjamin Stokes, who vanished as if swallowed by the dark itself, Luther Pettigrew dragged into a canal by hands. No one saw the whispers from other plantations. That word murmured across gullah-speaking quarters. River ghost. Claymore placed his hand on the pistol he now carried everywhere, a habit he'd developed after Pettigrew's death. He murmured aloud to no one. Samuel will be the end of me. The next morning, he acted. He ordered his estate manager to prepare Samuel for sale. He gave no reason. He insisted the sale be quick and quiet. Better to lose a strong worker than risk his own life. On November 3, 1835, Samuel was taken to the Savannah auction house in chains. His second time on that block. Hutchkins, the auctioneer, the same man who had sold him 4 years earlier, once again praised his strong constitution, good teeth, and sound obedience. A cotton planter named Vincent Hardesty purchased Samuel for $750. Samuel showed no emotion, not surprise, not fear, not anger. He simply lowered his head, climbed into the wagon with 4 other people who'd been bought that day, and let the horses pull him south toward Hardesty's estate in McIntosh County. And then silence. For 3 months after Samuel's departure, the killings at Riverbend stopped. No bodies, no vanishing overseers, no whispers about strange footprints near water. Claymore finally slept through the night. He told himself he had acted wisely. He had removed the threat, even if he couldn't prove who or what the threat really was. Riverbend went back to its terrible normal. Men died of fever instead of strangulation. Bodies were buried from disease rather than drowning. Claymore convinced himself the nightmare had ended. He was wrong. The ghost followed the sale. On February 17, 1836, a slave catcher named Josiah Merrick was found dead in a creek near Hardesty's plantation where Samuel now lived and worked. Merrick's body bore the same marks seen at Riverbend: bruising on the throat, water in the lungs, drowning in water too shallow to drown a grown man. Local authorities noted the similarity but didn't connect the dots. The enslaved community did. They whispered names that white men refused to speak, and the river ghost began killing again. Not at Riverbend. Claymore had bought himself time. But now in McIntosh County, Samuel had simply relocated his war. Sold again and again and again. Over the next 14 years, Samuel was sold 9 more times, drifting down the Georgia and South Carolina coast. And everywhere he went, the pattern followed. Months of silence, careful observation, mapping the land, watching routine, and then death. Not random death, not drunken accidents, not missteps in the dark. Executions. Executions disguised as misfortune. Executions that white authorities refused to believe could come from a man with no rights and no freedom. Executions that enslaved people understood as justice. Every owner eventually felt a growing unease, the same unease Claymore had felt, the same fear, the same realization that something was wrong with this quiet field hand. But none of them had proof. Samuel never disobeyed, never spoke out, never fought. He simply worked and waited and killed, then got sold again the moment suspicion grew too heavy. The river ghost didn't run from plantation to plantation. Plantation owners pushed him along, selling him to save themselves, never realizing they were sending death into someone else's fields. Meanwhile, a legend grows. In the slave quarters from Edisto to Darien, Savannah to Brunswick, people whispered stories. Stories of a tall man who moved like water. Stories of an avenger who made overseers fear the canals the same way enslaved people feared the whip. Stories that white men claimed were superstition, but enslaved people knew a truth. Some said he could become part of the swamp, hold his breath longer than a man should, melt into fog, rise from water silently enough to kill before anyone heard a sound. But the older ones, the ones who knew how survival really worked, understood Samuel wasn't a ghost. He was a man with patience sharper than any blade. A man who turned the landscape itself into a weapon. A man who learned the river better than the overseers who died beside it. A man who refused to break. By 1845, the killings along the Georgia and South Carolina low country had become too frequent, too patented, too precise to dismiss as misfortune. Local sheriffs whispered about them, but avoided official reports. Planters prayed over them, but refused to admit what they feared. Slave catchers spoke the name Rivergo with lowered voices, and still no white authority could say with certainty who or what was responsible. That silence ended when the federal government stepped in. A U.S. Marshal named Silas Crenshaw was assigned to investigate the pattern of deaths that had quietly plagued plantations for more than a decade. Crenshaw was unlike the local men who'd fumbled through half-hearted inquiries. He was educated, methodical, and had no personal stake in protecting plantation reputations. He approached the matter with cold precision, like a man solving a puzzle rather than protecting a way of life. For 6 months, he buried himself in paperwork. He read plantation ledgers, auction records, coroner reports, private letters, and death certificates. He rode from Savannah to Beaufort, from Edisto to Dan, interviewing anyone who might recall the smallest detail. Slowly, he began charting deaths on a hand-drawn map. A pattern emerged, one that no plantation owner wanted to acknowledge. Each cluster of deaths followed the movement of one enslaved man sold repeatedly over 14 years. The man was always listed under the same name, Samuel. Always described as tall. Always sold after a death never before. Always quiet, obedient, unremarkable on paper. But the deaths told a different story. Crenshaw documented at least 112 killings that matched Samuel's movements. Victims drowned in shallow water. Men found with bruised throats but no witnesses. Bodies discovered near canals, rivers, marshes, or swamps. Deaths that slaves whispered about and whites tried to explain away as accidents. The marshal didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in patterns. And the pattern screamed of a single relentless hand. On July 10, 1845, Crenshaw submitted a formal request for a federal warrant. It listed Samuel as the prime suspect in a series of murders stretching from Savannah to Charleston. The request was granted immediately. 4 days later, Crenshaw led a detachment of armed men to the Tarpentine camp where Samuel had reportedly been last seen. Workers confirmed he had eaten breakfast with them that morning. They had watched him walk toward his cabin, but when Crenshaw pushed open the cabin door, the pallet was empty. Samuel's wooden bowl, his blanket, and his spare shirt was still there, things no runaway would ever leave behind. It was as if the man had dissolved into the forest. Crenshaw ordered dogs brought from Charleston. Patrols combed through pine forests, marsh reeds, and swamp water. The marshal questioned every enslaved person in the camp, searching for fear that might betray the truth. But they all said the same thing. Samuel had been there, and then he wasn't. No one saw him leave. No one claimed to know where he'd gone. No one offered a single clue. The marshal refused to give up. He posted men on every road, every ferry crossing, every bridge, creek, and inlet. He sent descriptions to sheriffs across Georgia and South Carolina. He offered a reward so large that enslaved people could have bought their freedom by turning Samuel in. Not one person came forward. Not one voice broke the silence. Not one enslaved man or woman betrayed Samuel. For weeks the search dragged on. Shaw followed every rumor, every sighting, every whisper, and every time he arrived moments too late. Samuel had become more than a man. He was a shadow moving through the low country, slipping through every crack in the land escape. And then on October the 3rd, 1845, the marshal's own body was found. They discovered him at the bottom of a ravine near the Altamaha River. His neck was broken. His rifle lay beside him, unfired. His horse stood calmly a quarter-mile away. Local authorities concluded he had fallen while tracking someone through uneven terrain. The report was stamped accidental death, but the men who knew he had watched the only man capable of catching him and removed him from the board with the same cold certainty he'd used on overseers, planters, catchers, and sheriffs. After Crenshaw's death, the investigation collapsed. No one else volunteered to step into a dead marshal's shoes. Plantation owners suppressed reports. Newspapers stayed silent. And the killings like the tide continued their slow and steady rise. By the late 1840s, the fear along the coastal plantations was no longer a whisper. It was a sickness. Overseers refused to work alone. Slave catchers demanded higher wages or quit altogether. Some planters sold their entire estates and fled north. The legend of the river ghost grew stronger than any law, any patrol, any pistol a white man could carry. And Samuel, if that was still his name, became the most hunted man in the South. A man no one could catch. A man no one could betray. A man who moved like water through the swamps and killed like darkness itself. By the late 1840s, the Low Country had entered a quiet panic. Plantation owners didn't speak openly about the deaths anymore. Doing so only made them feel powerless. Overseers carried pistols on both hips. Slave catchers traveled in groups instead of alone. Even the most arrogant planters began avoiding the marsh paths after dark. Yet for all their precautions, the killings continued with the same cold patience as before. Always near water, always without witnesses, always impossible to explain. Samuel sold and resold across Georgia and South Carolina, left behind a trail that no official dared to name. Each sale was supposed to contain him. Each new plantation owner believed they could control him. Each thought cruelty or caution or strict discipline would keep him in line. And every time after weeks or months of silence, the pattern returned like the rising tide. Overseers vanished. Slave catchers never returned from patrol. Men known for brutality were found dead in ditches, ponds, canals, and creeks, drowned in water so shallow it could barely wet a man's boots. For enslaved people, these deaths were not tragedies. They were messages. Proof that the system could bleed. Proof that the river could swallow down those who had spent their lives drowning others. They never spoke Samuel's name to whites, but at night in the quarters they whispered stories about him, half man, half shadow. Someone who moved silently through the cane fields. Someone who slipped beneath the water and rose up behind the men who thought they were untouchable. A symbol of vengeance. A myth with a pulse. By 1850, the river ghost wasn't just a tale. It was an epidemic. And the white men who depended on fear to maintain order were suddenly learning what it felt like to fear the dark themselves. Some plantations couldn't keep overseers. Slave catchers demanded 3 times their usual rates. A handful of owners, those who understood how much the killings were costing them, sold everything and fled to Charleston or Savannah, abandoning the land rather than risk becoming the next corpse dragged from a canal. Still, no one dared say the truth aloud. One enslaved man was dismantling the slave system from the inside. Then, in 1860, the world beyond the plantations caught fire. The country fractured along the line between slavery and freedom. Political arguments turned into threats, then into violence. The South pushed toward secession, convinced that its entire way of life was under attack. While newspapers shouted about abolitionists and tariffs, The marshes kept their own quiet war. One man hunting the very people who claimed to own him. On April 12, 1861, when Confederate cannons fired on Fort Sumter, everything changed overnight. Planters rushed to join the war. Overseers enlisted. Slave patrols dissolved as their men rode off to fight for the Confederacy. The entire system that had kept enslaved people under constant surveillance suddenly cracked wide open. For 4 brutal years, the American Civil War ripped across the nation. But in the swamps of Georgia and the rice fields of South Carolina, another conflict continued beneath the surface. With patrols gone and fewer eyes watching, Samuel became even harder to track. Confederate soldiers posted along supply lines near the rivers started turning up dead. Picket vanished. Couriers were found drowned. Men sent to guard bridges or maintain water routes simply failed to return. In 1863, a Confederate colonel named Marcus Talbot wrote a letter now preserved in the National Archives, complaining that one Negro had been killing his men for months. His soldiers called the killer the River Ghost. They begged not to stand night watch near the creeks. Some believed the man had been killing white men for decades. Talbot requested permission to pull soldiers from the front lines to hunt him. His superiors denied it. The Confederacy was losing the war. They couldn't spare a single rifle for a ghost. And so the killings continued, hidden beneath the thunder of cannons and the marching of armies. Even in the middle of a civil war, one man continued his personal campaign, silent, methodical, unrelenting. He killed overseers when he could find them, slave catchers when he crossed their paths, Confederate soldiers when they ventured too close to the rivers he knew so well. By the time the war ended in 1865, when Lee surrendered at Appomattox, and the broken Confederacy collapsed, the deaths attributed to the River Ghost had surpassed 200. And still, no one had ever caught him. No one had ever seen him clearly. No one, not one enslaved person, had ever betrayed him. The war freed millions, but it erased the paper trail that had followed Samuel's movements. No more bills of sale, no more plantation ledgers, no more overseers reporting accidents. With slavery gone, Samuel vanished into the chaos of Reconstruction. His trail went cold. The River Ghost faded back into myth, a whisper shared between the descendants of those who survived bondage. But the story wasn't finished. Not yet. Because somewhere years later, in a quiet Freedman settlement, an old man appeared who knew far too much. And some people believed the ghost had come home one last time. When the Civil War ended in 1865, the South collapsed into a kind of stunned silence. Plantations lay abandoned. Families were scattered. Freedmen roamed the countryside searching for wives, husbands, and children sold away long ago. And in that great migration, thousands moving, thousands hiding, thousands trying to rebuild a life that had never been theirs. Samuel's trail vanished. The killing stopped. The newspapers never mentioned the River Ghost again. White society convinced itself it had been a rumor, an exaggeration, a superstition born out of wartime fear. But in the Gull communities of the Low Country, those isolated tight-knit enclaves along the coast, people continued to whisper, not loudly, never publicly, but around fire pits, on porches at dusk, in the soft cadence of Gull tongue. The story survived. They believed he lived. They believed he had slipped into the swamps where white men did not follow. They believed he was waiting for the world to change enough that he could die in peace. Those whispers gained new life in the summer of 1877, 12 years after the war. In a small settlement near Beaufort, South Carolina, a stranger arrived on foot. It was one of dozens of freedmen villages carved out of broken plantation land. 40 or so families farming tiny plots, fishing the creeks, trying to survive Reconstruction's hunger and violence. The man was old, older than most men who had lived through slavery. His back was bent, his hair white, his hands knotted with scars that looked like rope, fire, and iron. He carried nothing but a small bundle containing a blanket and a wooden bowl. He did not give a name. When someone finally asked what they should call him, he replied quietly, "Call me whatever suits you. The name don't mean much anymore." He moved into an abandoned cabin on the edge of the settlement. Within a week, he had repaired the roof, patched the walls, and cleared a small garden. He lived alone, spoke little, attended no church services, joined no gatherings. Some of the young people found him unsettling. Something about the way he moved, even at his age, suggested strength that had once been extraordinary. Something about his eyes seemed older than his body, like they had watched things no one should ever have had to see. Still, he troubled no one. He fished. He tended his garden. He kept to his silence. Months passed. The settlement accepted him as part of the background. The old people whispered among themselves, wondering where he had come from. None of them dared ask. And then one warm evening something happened that broke his quiet anonymity. Several younger men were sitting around a fire talking about the old days, about the plantations where they'd been enslaved. One man named Isaiah in his early 30s mentioned a rice plantation outside Savannah where he had spent part of his childhood. He spoke the owner's name with the bitterness of memory. Thaddeus Claymore. He described the cruelty of Claymore's overseers, the beatings, the disappearances, the 3 overseers who died in what the white folks had called accidents. Before Isaiah could continue, a voice spoke from the shadows beyond the firelight. It was calm, steady, but carried something cold beneath the surface. Claymore drowned in 1852. The old man said fell into one of his own rice canals. They said it was an accident. Slipped on the bank, hit his head. They pulled him out too late, buried him with a marble stone. Isaiah stared at him stunned. How you know that? That plantation was miles from here. He was there. The old man stepped forward into the glow of the fire just enough for the light to catch the lines on his face. His expression was unreadable, something between memory and satisfaction. I was there, he said. I was standing right beside the canal when it happened. Silence fell around the fire like a dropped stone. Isaiah opened his mouth to ask more, but the old man turned away. He walked back toward his cabin and vanished into the dark. No one followed him. No one dared. After that night, he spoke of the past no more. He lived as quietly as before. The settlement let the matter rest. But the older people, the elders who had survived the worst of slavery, began treating him with a strange reverence. They didn't ask questions. They didn't need answers. They knew. The younger generation talked about the old man like a ghost. The elders talked about him like a man fulfilling a purpose. And though no one said his name aloud, everyone understood the gravity of what he had implied by that fire. He had not just witnessed Claymore's death. He had caused it. And if that was true, he was no ordinary man. He was the river ghost himself. For 6 more years, the old man lived in that settlement peacefully, quietly, almost as if he had finally found a place where the ghosts of his past could not reach him, a place where no overseer would ever shout his name again. In July 1883, on a humid night heavy with the smell of salt and pine, the old man died in his sleep. His neighbor found him the next morning lying peacefully on his mat, hands folded across his chest. No struggle, no fear, just a long, exhausted life finally letting go. The community buried him in their small cemetery. A plain wooden cross was placed at the head of the grave. No name, no carving, just a marker for a man who had never truly needed one. Dozens attended his burial, more than would ever gather for a man who lived mostly in silence. After the service, when everyone else drifted away, 3 elderly women remained standing by the fresh earth. They were the oldest in the settlement. They had seen slavery with their own eyes. They knew the old rhythms of fear and survival. One finally spoke. He was the river ghost, wasn't he? Another woman answered softly, whoever he was, he gave back what they gave us. He did what needed doing. The third woman, the oldest, looked at the grave and whispered, some stories ain't meant to be told all the way. Let the white folks wander. Let them feel what we felt. Looking over their shoulders, not knowing when something might step out of the dark. Then the 3 women turned and walked away, leaving the grave unmarked, unclaimed, and sacred in a way no church ever understood. Samuel, if that had ever truly been his name, returned to the silence from which he had come. After the old man's burial, the settlement returned to its rhythm. Fishing, farming, rebuilding, healing. But something lingered in the air, an unspoken understanding that their quiet visit had carried a history far larger than the boundaries of their small village. No one carved his name into the wooden cross. No one recorded his story in church papers or county records. Instead, they did what generations of enslaved people had always done with dangerous truths. They carried it in silence. Outside the freedmen settlements, the myth of the river ghost slowly faded. White communities moved on, eager to bury the past with the same shovels they once used to bury the men who died under suspicious circumstances. Plantation owners who survived Reconstruction never spoke of the killings. They preferred stories of misfortune, bad luck, or divine punishment over admitting that one enslaved man had outwitted and outlived them. Historians who later combed through archives found traces, court records, death reports, plantation letters, but no name, no conviction, no confession. To them, the river ghost became a curiosity, a whisper from a violent past. Some dismissed the idea entirely, claiming the deaths were exaggerated or that multiple individuals had been blamed on a single phantom. Others argued that slave folklore often created larger-than-life figures as symbols of resistance. But the people who whispered the story in Gull knew better. They remembered the bruises on the throats of overseers. They remembered the bodies that drifted into the rice canals. They remembered the fear that spread through plantations like sickness. They remembered the man who knew every ditch, every tidal pattern, every hidden path through the marsh. And most importantly, they remembered the silence they had chosen collectively, fiercely to maintain. No enslaved person ever betrayed Samuel. Not for money, not under torture, not even to save their own lives. To outsiders, that silence appeared mysterious. To the community, it was justice. Because Samuel, whether one man or many, represented something the slave system never understood. The enslaved watched everything. They remembered everything. They talked among themselves in languages white men didn't bother to learn. They passed secrets, warnings, routes, names, and knowledge behind the back of people who believed them. Too simple to plan, too broken to resist. The river ghost wasn't just a killer. He was the embodiment of a truth white society feared to acknowledge, that the people they claimed to own were never powerless. Even after emancipation, the elders kept the story alive. They told small fragments to children, never the whole tale at once. They passed along warnings about rivers, stories about vengeance, whispers about a man who could appear and vanish like mist. But they never spoke his real name, not because they had forgotten it, but because preserving the mystery protected him, protected his legacy, protected the quiet justice he had carved with his own hands. Over time, the story became layered. Some added details, some removed them. Some believed the river ghost had been multiple men whose actions merged into one legend. Others insisted Samuel was real, that he had lived among them, died among them, and walked into the afterlife with the same silent dignity he carried through the swamps. And as the decades passed, the truth grew softer around the edges, wrapped in folklore and memory, but never fully erased. The descendants of the enslaved still told the story carefully, respectfully, as a reminder that resistance took many forms, some loud, some quiet, some violent, and some hidden beneath the water. The official historical record may never confirm Samuel's existence. It may never list his victims, never acknowledge his war, never honored the power he held in the shadows. But the silence of the enslaved, the silence that protected him for 30 years, remains one of the strongest pieces of evidence that he lived. For if he had been a mere myth, someone would have traded his name for money. Someone would have broken under threat. Someone would have spoken. No one ever did because some stories belong to the people, not the record books. And some justice was meant to stay in the dark where the river ghost walked. 2211's 5:17 p.m. Kosht KHN. History likes to pretend it knows everything. It catalogues dates, names, battles, laws, and statistics with cold precision. It builds monuments to the powerful and graves for the forgotten. But the truth is far more complicated. The truth is full of shadows, of stories that were never written down, of voices that were never recorded, of people whose lives were erased because they did not fit neatly into the version of America that those in power wanted preserved. The story of the river ghost is one of those shadows. Officially, he does not exist. No court conviction, no public confession, no signed document identifying him as anything more than a field hand, no grave with a proper name. And yet, the bodies he left behind were real enough to fill multiple cemeteries. The fear he carved into the hearts of overseers and slave catchers shaped entire regions. The silence of the enslaved communities, absolute, unwavering, was as solid as any monument ever built. Historians today argue among themselves. Some say the river ghost must have been a collective invention, a comfort story whispered by enslaved people who needed hope in a hopeless world. They suggest the deaths attributed to him were random accidents embellished through retelling. Some historians dismiss the entire story as little more than folklore, arguing that fear and rumor transformed a series of unrelated deaths into a single terrifying legend. Others disagree. They point to the remarkable consistency of the kings of the victims, the locations, the methods, and the narrow stretch of rivers, marshes, and canals where they occurred. To them, coincidence seems far less convincing than the possibility that one extraordinarily patient man used the Low Country's waterways as both his refuge and his weapon. Yet the real answer may never be found in plantation journals, sheriff's reports, or courthouse ledgers. Those records were written by the people who held power. The truest archive of slavery was never kept on paper. It survived in memory. It lived in whispered stories, passed from one generation to the next by the people who endured what official history often refused to acknowledge. Those memories tell of a man who would not surrender, a man who learned every river bend, every hidden channel, and every forgotten trail better than the men who claimed ownership over him. A man who transformed the very landscape into an instrument of resistance. He did not kill out of rage alone. He acted with patience, precision, and a grim understanding that justice would never arrive through the courts, the law, or the people who upheld the system. If justice was never coming, he would create it himself. In the end, it may not matter whether Samuel spent his final years in a quiet freedman's settlement or disappeared forever into the endless marshes of the South. It may never be known whether the elderly man remembered by later generations truly was the river ghost, or simply someone entrusted with keeping the legend alive. Because the river ghost became something greater than one man. He became a symbol, a reminder that resistance often survives in silence, a warning that no system built on cruelty is ever as invincible as it believes. He came to represent every enslaved person who fought back in ways history failed to record, every fugitive who vanished into the swamps, every quiet act of courage that never appeared in official documents, every whispered name carried from one cabin to another beneath the cover of darkness. In a world determined to strip him of his humanity, Samuel reclaimed it through the only weapons left to him: patience, knowledge, the land itself, and the silent waters that concealed both his movements and his story. Whether every detail of this legend is true or not, one fact remains impossible to ignore. No one ever captured the man they believed responsible. No one betrayed him, and no one succeeded in erasing his story. For many, that may be the closest thing to justice that hero ever allowed. Now the question belongs to you. Do you believe a single man could wage a secret war for decades, moving through rivers and marshes, striking more than 200 men without ever being identified? Or do you believe the river ghost was something even greater, not one individual, but the living symbol of countless acts of resistance woven together into a single unforgettable legend? Was Samuel simply a man, or had he become the embodiment of defiance itself? History offers no final answer. Its records are incomplete. Its silence is deliberate. But the rivers remember, the marshes remember, and the people who survived those dark years remembered as well. If this story changed the way you think about the hidden chapters of American history, support Echoes of Silence by subscribing to the channel, sharing this video with fellow history lovers, and leaving a comment below. Tell us your thoughts. Do you believe the river ghost truly existed, or do you see him as a legend born from